Welcome. This is the first of many Gargoyles panels this weekend. My name is Weisman. I'm the creator and one of the producers of Gargoyles. This is my partner on the show, Frank Paur, who is the producer and supervising director of the show. Guler was the lead character designer on the show and also did all the covers and one of the issues of the Gargoyles comic book from SLG. Just to be clear, we have a Gargoyles Q&A with these people, and Maria Sirtis, Corinne Charlebois, and Christopher Jones at 8:30. So we may not have time for questions at this panel because we've got a story to tell you. But if we don't, the whole panel this evening is all for questions, so don't worry about that. We also have tomorrow a Gargoyles Biology and Culture panel at 2 to 3, which will be more of a discussion. And just in case that's not enough, we've got the blue panel at 10 p.m. tomorrow night. That's if you want to talk about more R-rated gargoyle subjects. And then finally, Sunday at 12:30 p.m., we have a fan panel, so that's sort of a discussion. I don't know what the difference between that panel is, frankly, but we'll make it up as we go along. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Goodbye. No, wait. Rewind. Rewind. Yes. Okay. So we're here to talk about how Gargoyles came to be. All three of us were involved with that, but I'm going to start because I was there at the beginning. I was at the time director of series development for Walt Disney Television Animation, and the way we worked things back in those days is that the guy who ran the entire Walt Disney Company was a man named Michael Eisner. And once every 6 months, I would take a slate of properties, of potential shows, usually about 6 or 7 shows, and I would pitch them all to Michael. And we had this thing called the Disney Afternoon. Who here remembers the Disney Afternoon? Nobody. I didn't want a show of hands, I wanted cheers. That's better. So we called the Disney Afternoon, internally we called it the Beast. Because we always had to have a new virgin show to feed the beast. And so Michael knew this, so every 6 months he would pick 1 or 2 shows, either for the Disney Afternoon or for a Saturday morning. And so in 1991, we were looking for, as always, more new shows, and how many of you were not yet born in 1991? Okay, so the Gargoyles property is older than you people. So there was a show that we had called Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears, which we... There we go. That's the enthusiasm I want to hear from here on out.
That was just Gummy Bears.
I know. And we were all big fans of that show. It was created by a guy named Jim Magon, very talented guy. But we felt it didn't get enough respect. It was an original show, but because it was named after a candy, and because there was another show on the air at the same time called the Care Bears, and they both were about multicolored bears, there was a lot of confusion between those two shows. The Care Bears was kind of awful, and Gummy Bears was kind of great. And it had this rich backstory and this rich mythology all set in this medieval world. So we wanted to create something like that we thought might get more respect. I had been fascinated with gargoyles since at least college. I collected postcards of them and took photos of my friends posing like gargoyles next to actual gargoyles. And
working with gargoyles?
Yeah, and I just always liked them, so I suggested doing gargoyles that we do this sort of rich medieval backstory for. But we'd set it in the present. We had the gargoyles wake up, modern day New York, pretty much on at least some levels the show that you guys all ended up seeing and liking enough to come to this panel. And we liked that idea, so we developed it. There was a team of us, and we worked on developing it, and we put together this pitch. And in those days, things are more sophisticated now, but in those days, we just get a bunch of art cards, and you'll see in a minute how I did it. We get a bunch of art cards, and I would script this pitch to go with it. And it was actually very carefully scripted. Every joke, every moment in it was scripted, but I would do it in such a way that it sounded completely spontaneous and off the cuff. Hopefully, yes. And so we created a show that was very much like Gummy Bears. We had about 5 or 6 cute little multicolored gargoyles. They were all little. And it was a comedy adventure show, very much in the vein of DuckTales or Gummy Bears or Tailspin or any of those shows.
It always reminded me a lot of Elvin and the Chipmunk. And the Chipmunks at that point. Wasn't there a guy?
No, it was a girl. It was the proto-Elisa character. It was always a girl. But we went through a lot of different occupations for her and a lot of different names. At one point she was a librarian. At one time she worked in a museum. At one point she was a firefighter. At one point she was a stay-at-home mom with 2 kids. She was black. She was white. She was Hispanic. She was all sorts of things. It was always a girl. And at one point she was the descendant of the character that became Princess Catherine in the show. She was an actual descendant of Catherine, as we threw that idea out. But we pitched this show to Michael Eisner, who did not like it and didn't buy it. But we still felt like there was something to it. We thought there was an idea there that we still really liked. And so I brought in a number of people, I think including Greg, to look at the show that we had and sort of suggest ideas for us, what another direction we might take it. And a guy named Tad Stones, who was the creator of Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers and Darkwing Duck. Cool. Chip and Dale are feeling kind of bad.
Yeah.
But Darkwing's happy.
Yeah. Somewhere Tad is going, they're praising me in Minnesota.
And Tad came in, and Tad had almost no involvement with Gargoyles except this key 5 minutes where he saw the original comedy pitch. And he said, well, what, at the time Disney had this movie, it was this little movie called Beauty and the Beast that was doing very well. And he suggested, what if instead of having all these little gargoyles, you had one big gargoyle? And you played that relationship with your female character. And that really sort of clicked for me. And we took the whole comedy show, we created Goliath. There was no antecedent to Goliath. We created Goliath, and we took the whole show and put it through the prism of Goliath. So we had a character named Ralph, who was this older gargoyle who liked to stay at home and sit on the couch and watch TV. He became Hudson. We had this character, Coco, who was this gargoyle who loved to dance, and she became Broadway. And then we had 2 gargoyles, Amp and Lassie. Lassie was a guy, by the way, but he admired the dog a lot. And they became Lex and Brooklyn. They sort of switched bodies because Amp had Brooklyn's personality and Lassie was a little bit like Lex, but the body shapes were more like the other one. And we had a character named Dakota, who had been a hero, sort of the leader actually, and she felt kind of dull. But when we turned her into Demona and made her the villain, suddenly she wasn't dull. And Elisa became a cop. Finally, we locked in on that. A Hispanic cop, Elisa Chavez. We had a lot of names for Elisa over the years. Morgan. A lot of those names wound up showing up in the show. Bluestone, Morgan, Chavez. She went through a lot of names. And
Bronx was originally a comedic character.
yeah, he's still comedic in the picture you're about to see. So they were all, we created this drama show, and we loved this show, so we kept, and at that point, I brought Greg in because we had done this comedy development and we needed to have these things feel more like action heroes. And Greg and I had both been at DC Comics in the 80s, and Greg was on Darkwing doing props. So he's drawing chairs and pencils and things like that, and I thought,
A lot of fun.
yeah, I thought this guy's being wasted on chairs. Yeah. So Greg came in and he fundamentally designed, well, for starters, Goliath, Demona, and Elisa, and worked on all the characters, but specifically those three he really kind of created. And we kept coming up with more art and more art. The pitch kept getting longer and longer and longer, so that it finally, you know, it had the pack in it, and it had the mutates in it, and it had all this great stuff that you eventually saw in the show was in this pitch. So the pitch was like 40, 45 cards long or something like that, and we were really excited. This had so much great stuff in it. We went in and we pitched it to Eisner. He said no. So the next day, we had what we called a post-mortem meeting.
Which are always a lot of fun.
Right. And actually, you know, he had said no to Gargoyles, but he had bought, I want to say, it was either Bonkers or Goof Troop, I just forget which meeting that was. So we were talking about how we were going to go forward on that show, whichever one it was. And then at the end, we're all starting to leave, and Jeffrey stops us. Jeffrey was head of Walt Disney Studios, so he was sort of the number 2 guy right under Eisner, as far as my bosses were concerned. And Jeffrey said, oh, and you're going to work on Gargoyles some more. And I'm like, well, no, Michael killed it yesterday. I mean, we pitched it as a comedy, and he said no. And then we pitched it as a drama, action show. He said no, so no. He said, no, Michael liked it. He just thought it needed more work. So my bosses and I was there with two of my bosses, two of my immediate bosses, Gary Kreisel, who was president of the division, and Bruce Cranston, who was vice president of development. And we sort of looked at each other and we're like, okay, we'll do that. What that was saying to us is that, you know, Jeffrey liked it. Michael hadn't liked it, but Jeffrey had liked it. And he's not going to contradict Michael in the meeting with Michael, but he wanted us to take another shot at it. I also found out later that my boss Gary had talked to Jeffrey and said, look, we can't just only do funny animals. We can't only do Tailspins, and you know, as great as Darkwing and Tailspin and DuckTales and all those shows are, if all we do in the Disney afternoon is one funny animal show after another, eventually people will start to get tired of it. So they were sort of actively looking to get into another arena.
And Batman was a big hit.
No, this not yet. This was a little bit before that. Yeah. Not that Batman wasn't a big hit, but it wasn't out yet. So, we went back to the drawing board a third time. The problem was this time we loved the show. We didn't want to change the show at all. All we wanted to change was the pitch. So what we did is we cut tons of stuff out of the pitch. All stuff that we eventually put back into the show. Pack, mutates, all this stuff. And we weren't going to change the show, but we felt like all that stuff had been a distraction in the pitch. So we really focused the pitch on the Goliath-Elisa Beauty and the Beast relationship. Because as I may have mentioned, there was this big movie Disney had. That Michael was very familiar with, and we thought he'd get that. So we cut the pitch way, way down. And if we could show the original show pitch, it's got to push down one on the little clock.
There you go.
There you go. And this is more or less the pitch we did, only with a lot better production values. You get the lights. Weisman, co-creator and co-producer of the Gargoyles television series. What you're about to see is the pitch we made back in 1993, 1994 to sell the show to Disney Upper Management, to stations all across the United States. Hope you like it. Hi, I'm Greg Weisman.
Turn it up.
Seriously.
Turn it up.
That's as loud as it goes.
Very excited about it.
think it's something very new for Disney, and it's all about gargoyles. Ugly stone statues that squat on the roofs of old buildings. But 1,000 years ago,
Can you pause it?
gargoyles were real
Just hit
living
pause.
creatures.
Can we get the lights back on for a second? Is there a way to turn the machine up?
You could put a microphone in front of that speaker.
Just repeat everything. This was a show about gargoyles. Anyone here know how to use a mixing board? Volunteers? If you know, come forward. If you don't pretend.
Probably better off on the floor. Try this again. We're trying to show stuff that you can't show us.
Let's just play right. Right, everyone, we're going to do a little experimentation.
The day they slept frozen in stone. When the sun went down, Goliath, the gargoyle master, would lead his gargoyle warriors in defense of the king's castle.
Got it?
If there was no battle to be fought, he'd retreat to
Lights.
the library to read and learn, all the while making sure that the other gargoyles stayed out of trouble. And for all these efforts, Goliath received no reward, no thanks, or even kindness. In fact, the people of the castle treated all gargoyles with nothing but contempt. Still, Goliath could no more stop guarding the castle than breathing the air. It's part of a gargoyle's nature to be territorial, protective. And so, for years, he maintained his lonely vigil. Then one night, Goliath was betrayed and lured away from his post. The castle was overrun and sacked. Goliath and the surviving gargoyles were unfairly blamed, and the kingdom sorcerer laid a curse upon them and put them into a stone sleep that lasted 1,000 years. New York City, 1994. A rich and powerful man has decided there's a better place for a medieval castle than a picturesque hill in Scotland. Lock, stock, and gargoyle to the top of the tallest skyscraper in Manhattan. All of which means absolutely nothing to New York City police detective Elisa Chavez. She doesn't care about castles and she doesn't believe in curses. She's hot on the trail of a major bad guy. A trail that leads her right into an ambush. Unfortunately, a shadowy figure sees what's happening and decides to help. And of course, that shadowy figure is Goliath, the gargoyle. Now, when you're as strong as Goliath, bench pressing two bad guys is easy. That stone-like hide of his makes him practically invulnerable to everything but Elisa's kindness. She is the first human being who's ever offered him understanding and friendship, hope, and a sense of purpose. She introduces him to his new home, Manhattan, and asks for his help in protecting it against modern-day barbarians. Fortunately, our hero doesn't have to face those barbarians alone. This is Goliath's old friend Hudson, a veteran gargoyle warrior. Hudson helps out by keeping an eye on the young warriors in training. Brooklyn, Lexington, and Broadway. They pick their own names. There's Bronx, the angst-ridden gargoyle dog. Bronx is not a big fan of adventure. He just likes to eat a lot, sleep a lot, and make a general mess. Now, Goliath has wider interests, but it can be hard for a 7-foot-tall medieval monster to squeeze into the modern world, especially with Xanatos around. Rich, powerful, and arrogant, Xanatos bought the gargoyles' castle. Now he thinks he owns the gargoyles as well. If something rotten is happening in New York City, the odds are Xanatos is behind it. But Goliath's greatest foe is the evil gargoyle Demona. Once she and Goliath were friends, but 1,000 years ago it was her betrayal that cost him the castle. And now she's his sworn enemy, and she won't rest until she owns the night. The night is all that matters, because the gargoyles still sleep as stone statues during the day, finding an outdoor ledge just before sunrise and striking a pose that could give you nightmares. But when the sun goes down, their only protection against the city's dark terrors. They are the gargoyles. Joining the Disney family.
right.
Did he go for it?
All right, so the first thing I want to comment on is the DVD of Dorian Gray you just saw, where, except that he stays young and I keep getting old. Anyway, we pitched the show the third time, and the third time was the charm, and Michael bought the show the third time, and we brought Frank in. So I've been doing a lot of talking, so you guys want to talk about your first experiences on the series? Well, Greg, you go first since you came on.
Well, I got a call from Bob Klein, who was, what was his title?
Art director.
He was the art director on it. And I went up there and talked to them a little bit about what I'd done and showed them some samples. And I remember Bob said, well, you know, this stuff's a little stiff, but I think it'll work. Anyway, initially I was brought in to design Goliath, and the way that happened was they had already had an idea that they wanted him to be a little reminiscent of Chernabog from Fantasia. So we had two ways basically, well actually three ways to go with the wings, and that was bat wings, the traditional wings that he had, and then feathers or some kind of pterodactyl wing thing. And everybody liked the bat wings first. So what really, how Goliath was designed, at least by me, was to, in pieces. They had Disney sure didn't want these guys to look satanic in any way, so I think, I don't know who exactly came with the idea of rows of little horns that go back were far less satanic in the direction to go with.
That's
far less sort of Saint.
Yeah, it's true. We actually studied horns and came to the conclusion that if the horns angled back the way, like his hair,
Yeah.
it wouldn't look satanic, but if you tilted the horns forward, suddenly he looked like a demon. And so we had to be very careful, even as we went forward with the other gargoyles, that gargoyle horns always angle back, they never angle forward.
And the thing that I basically, I guess, came up with, that the gargoyles are dragon people, or dinosaur people. And, you know, that helped, I guess, a little bit to get away from the reptile, scary kind of thing. Of course, Disney they were very careful about this whole thing. They were worried about it. And so what happened is I'd go back after working on Darkwing Duck during the day, I'd go back to my apartment and I'd just draw gargoyles after gargoyles. And real gargoyles were really no help, because the ones you see on buildings are ugly, but not really appealing ugly. You know, they're just ugly. And so I would come in with my drawings of, you know, I do 10 drawings of Goliath, and Greg would say, I like these horns, I like this face, I like this attitude. I remember I drew one gargoyle that didn't have an arm because I wanted to show what his back and stuff looked like, and that was the one they liked the attitude of because he was kind of romantically arrogant. And so little by little, Goliath kind of came together, and then Hudson and Lisa and some of the other characters did. But we weren't at the time concerned about making them animatable. At the time, all we wanted to do was make them scary, and some of those Goliath faces are way scarier than I would have drawn them, so you must have forced me to do that, or something. Somebody said to do that.
Your arms.
Yeah, make it really scary. So after we got to the point where the show was approved, I want to mention another artist on there. His name was Paul Felix, and he was the guy that did the little kid with the gargoyle shadow on him. He did a lot of the layouts and backgrounds. He's an amazing artist who's gone on and, you know, he art directed Lilo and Stitch, and he's still at the thing. But
We actually had 4 artists. In that pitch art you saw, there was a lot of work by Greg, Paul Felix, Bob Klein, who Greg mentioned, and Dave Schwartz also did some of that.
Yeah, and you know, back in those days, you'd sit in a tiny office with markers, And after a day of doing that, you couldn't see straight. It was like, people would open the door.
Pretty good, right?
Yeah, we were like, hey, look at this. This knife goes right through here. But it was, people would come in and go, you got, oh my God. And because everything, you know, now you press a button and you change something. Back then we'd have to make a whole new copy and start over if the color wasn't what they wanted.
And I think that last image with the kid in the Mickey Mouse hat was just something that Paul did for fun and put up in his
He was
office.
always doing stuff like
Right, and I came into his office one day and I saw that and I said, that's going in the pitch.
Yeah, and you know, he's a really shy, quiet guy who, you know, never mentions that he's got this great piece of artwork sitting in his office. But if you go in there and see it, then he kind of looks at you amused. But, so then I had to go, I went back to, I think I was working on Quack Pack. Yeah, Quack Pack at the time. Or Duck Days. It had so many titles, I can't really remember which one they finally ended on. But and Frank came in. Before that, a couple other artists had tried to take those characters and make them animatable, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is horrible. You know, because I don't know what, they got mushy and weird. And then they brought Frank on, and when I saw the stuff that how he'd taken those characters and altered them to be animated, I was just stunned. I think it's brilliant stuff. And of course, it was all influenced by Batman a little bit, because that was, you know, when Bruce Timm did Batman, it was a big deal, because up to that point, every time they tried to make a superhero cartoon, they tried to draw all the muscles in, and all the anatomy in, and all the detail in, and it always looked horrible. So when Bruce Timm came in and, you know, streamlined all those characters and did such a beautiful job, I think people who cared about how the show looked recognized that fact and followed that lead. I mean, it was a brilliant lead.
One thing that you mentioned Batman earlier, and I said, well, it wasn't out yet, but what I should say is that between the second pitch to Eisner and the third pitch to Eisner, Batman the Animated Series came out.
And we were
And so
all
on top of the fact that we had reduced the pitch and made it a stronger pitch, we also had the fact that a great dramatic action animation show was out there and successful.
Yeah.
And so that also gave Michael a lot more confidence in saying, well, all right, let's give this a try.
Well, it was funny because we'd go in, we were still developing stuff.
By the way, we stole Frank from Batman. That's
Yeah. But we'd be developing it, and Gary Kreisel would come in and say, oh, you know, I don't know if we're going to do this show because Batman's down in the ratings, and I don't know how much it could have been down in the ratings. But then, so we'd all kind of leave the meeting going, oh crap, you know, we did a lot of work on this. And then I'd be walking down the hall and I'd see Greg and I'd say, Gargoyles? And he'd go, it's up in the ratings. And the best one was, I think I saw him as the elevator doors were closing, and I said, Gargoyles? And he goes, up in the ratings. And the doors closed on him. So it finally did happen, but by then I'd left, and then they brought Frank in, and this is where he takes over the story.
I was given a call by your barber.
Yeah,
Paur.
Paur.
He called me. Now, I had worked, before I worked on Batman as a director, you know, I had also spent a couple of years at Disney previously, whereas basically we were doing storyboards for Tailspin and Chicken Little Rescue Wait a minute.
Now Tailspin's feeling really bad.
But the point was, I had worked there before and I knew a lot of the people there. And so I get this call and asked her to come over and talk with Greg and talk with Gary. And they pretty much gave me the pitch like that. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, you know, because on Batman, you know, when we were doing Batman, it was very, it opened up a lot of things, but we were very strict on how we could tell our stories because we wanted it to be very much a detective show. We didn't want to have any time travel episodes, we didn't want to have any real monster episodes, well, we had a couple of those. But for the most part, it was Batman beating up regular guys, you know, criminal type guys. So I'm over there, and I'm you know, it gives me this pitch, and I'm going, oh, medieval Scotland, armor, Vikings, we're Vikings, cool, castles, cool. You know, so I'm thinking a lot of this stuff, and it's like, you know, it just presented, the whole concept of Gargoyles presented opportunities to do an unlimited specter of genres. Within this show, you have your, like I said, you have Vikings, you have science fiction, you have horror, you have elements, you have comedy, you have all of these elements that it's very hard to mix and match these things unless you have a vehicle to do it with. And Greg, I don't know if you realized it or not, you had created something that would fit anything.
Yes.
Humble man.
But, you know, for me, that wasn't too unusual because I come from a background in comic books, and comic books is this bastard, I mean, superhero comics specifically, is this bastard genre. The superheroes accommodate science fiction and simultaneously magic and monsters and time travel. All this stuff is part of, you know, the superhero tradition. And we were doing superheroes without capes. I mean, you know, we weren't flagging them as superheroes. There weren't any costumes. There weren't any, you know, obvious elements that made you think guy in tights kind of thing. But on every other level, it was a superhero show. And so I knew that we would have the freedom, particularly once we got the ball rolling, if we got into multiple seasons, that we have the freedom to do a lot of these elements.
Yeah, so I agree. I agree. Leave Warner Brothers definitely started back there, and I worked with Greg on Gargoyles and developing this stuff. Now, Greg. On Batman, we had a particular type of style. Basically, you know, it was kind of a milk call thing where you were straight lines against curves, and it gives you a really nice fluid motion. It's very easy to draw. It looks great when it's moving. Previous to Batman, and I had also done work on another series, mostly just storyboarding, on a thing called X-Men, the animated series. And one of the things that always annoyed me on that show was animation looked like crap. And one of the reasons, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the things, you know, there's the timing and other things, but really you have a time constraints, and so you have this series that are trying to make these characters look as if they're right out of a comic book, with all the bulges and the cross-hatching. It just doesn't work in animation because you're not looking at a still picture, you're looking at something that's moving. And when I came over, one of the first things, you know, I knew pretty much what I wanted to do because of what I was doing on Batman, also because I was a big fan of a lot of the Disney films, you know, particularly Sleeping Beauty. And there was this other film. It was, I cannot remember the name of it, but it had an animated sequence that was set back in the time of Scotland and had a siege of Vikings on a Scottish castle. And it was like about a 5-10 minute sequence. I wish I could remember the name of it. It was just one of those things Disney made during the 50s and just threw it out there and disappeared.
Ron Boy or something.
I don't know. But it had this beautiful animation, simplified type of animation and feel to it. So with that, I kind of, you know, I started playing with the over the designs that had already been generated, and a lot of them also, I believe Walt Disney Japan had gone over everything that you saw up there. They had gone over, they had unified everything.
Yeah, because we had 4 different artist styles up there, so
they gave it an actual style look, but it still kind of had, you know, I wanted this show to say, well, it's Disney, it has to stand out, it has to compete. I don't want it to look like a standard superhero type show, and knowing how animators work, unless they have a something to hook into, they'll draw the same way. So chances are you're gonna have people who's drawing on X-Men, you're gonna be drawing Gargoyles, and they're gonna be drawing the same thing they're doing, because the styles, although what was done on the Gargoyle front was much better designed, it's still gonna be animated guys that draw a certain way, unless they have a hook. The hook is basically just a curve and straights, where it's just easy to animate, it flows. So I then took that, I went over it again myself, and then I had a meeting with Gary Kreisel, who was leery of the change, because the whole packet had to be redone. They had redone everything overseas. So I went overseas for about a month, that's 3 weeks. And Gary and I had met with the Mr. Toganaga and his team of artists over there, extremely talented people. And we presented to them my idea of simplifying the designs. And we laid all the artwork and everything out. And at first, they were kind of like going, well, we don't want to redo everything. Yeah. We have a schedule. Yeah. We have a schedule. But I'm thinking, well, yes, but you're going to make that schedule up later on, because it's going to save you a lot of headache later on down the line. So we then laid all the artwork on the table, and they conferred for about less than a minute. They all pointed to the stuff and says, we'll go ahead and we'll do this. And so then they put their spin on my stuff, and the result is a very unique looking show. Beautiful, the designs are lyrical. One of the things that as I was looking through the animation and how to kind of get it, I hooked into the whole nature of Celtic art. And it's a very lyrical type of feel. And in a way, it kind of matched what we were doing with Gargoyles. So it kind of fit that niche, that medieval Celtic niche that Greg had kind of worked from. So I felt it was a really great match. And the other plus side in working with Walt Disney Japan is they have a lot of resources that was not available to other studios. Meaning that most of those guys were trained by Disney animators. They had already come over from a studio called TMS, which is kind of like the #1 animation studio in Japan at the time. And I'm looking at the backgrounds, I'm looking at all these different environments, and if you know anything, if you follow any of my work, I get lost in details. To me, a background is not a piece of color you throw up on there for the character to play off. It's a participant in the film. And we're able to put that kind of detail on a show like Gargoyles. It just gives it another level, another layer of personality that you just really do not see in other things. I spent a few days in New York. And all I did was take pictures. Because the series was set in New York. I wanted to go to Scotland, Disney wouldn't let me do that. So it wasn't justified. But I went to New York instead. Because, again, working from shows even like Batman was very idealized type of goth, and it was more like a graveyard in its design, and it was purposely so. It wanted to hit you at an emotional level. Again, X-Men. Look at the backgrounds. We got streets this wide as these tables here, with skyscrapers and stuff. It just didn't make any sense. And the reason, when you look at those shows, you have these little wide streets and these little skinny buildings, is you go over there and that's kind of what it's like over there. They're not used to these big spaces. Everything is very compact. So naturally, when they draw these things, they draw from memory, what they know mostly. Unless you give them a lot of reference, that's what you're going to get.
We did a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about color palettes.
Oh, absolutely.
New York at night. and particularly in comparison to Gotham City.
Well, I remember talking about how Gotham City, there was never anybody on the street. And it always looked like it was night all the time. And I think Frank and Greg both did a great job of populating those streets, making them lit at night. I remember somebody, I don't know if it was you or who, but they had a map of Manhattan in their office. And the only building that wasn't true to Manhattan was, of course, the Gargoyle building. They'd been planted somewhere.
There were a few fictional buildings, but that was, but yeah, we put
Was that
the Erie building on, no, Central Park South. Yeah. But we tried to keep it real.
Well, that's the thing. We wanted, like I said, Batman is very dark and it is very moody, and the backgrounds are perfect for that show. Gargoyles wasn't about that. Gargoyles, in a way, is very, despite the origins of Goliath and his clan, is a very optimistic show. Batman is more nihilistic. It's going in there and beating somebody up and lurking in the shadows of this. We still have a lurking in the shadows, but when you go into Goliath, despite everything that happens to him, he's optimistic about life and about living and about the future. And that's what made it, to me, feel unique. So the city has to reflect that part of Goliath's psyche. It's like, again, where Batman was dark and moody, I wanted New York to be alive. And I wanted it to be colorful.
Right, because Goliath is only awakened. So if his color spectrum runs from brown to black to gray, then he's living a pretty boring life. So we wanted a lot of rich magentas and purples and blues and golds and things in there that really made the city at night be alive, because that was the city Goliath was seeing.
And anybody that's ever been to New York, it's very much like that. It's, at night, it's people all over the place, the lights are going on, which presented another set of problems that we had to figure out how to tell these stories without showing thousands of people all the time. So usually, we have a lot of action way up in the air. So when you look down, it's very deceiving on how detailed a lot of these backgrounds are, because we have streets of light against black background. The buildings, you kind of felt the buildings were there for the most part. But it was and we'd always stage, you never saw the bottom of the street, but you see the buildings just being lit, which would give it its depth and its dimension to it. So there are a lot of different things that we would play with. We couldn't show any kind of actual signage, which is always kind of a headache, because you have to get all that stuff approved.
You have to actually get letter fonts approved because they're owned by people.
Well, and also there was, this isn't true anymore, but there was an era where they didn't want anything written in English because they wanted to be able to sell it overseas, and if it was written in English, instead of just dubbing the voices, they'd have to change the picture. And so they didn't want, and at some point we reached a compromise which was we could show a sign in English as long as someone read it out loud. If it said,
Fish.
yeah, whatever. If it mattered at all,
Gold
if it
nuts. What we did, especially when you have a lot of shots of Times Square in that, and again, the studio that we dealt with overseas that did our backgrounds that first season, a studio by the name of Studio Fuga, which, Disney Japan subcontracted. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, are you familiar with Miyazaki? Yeah. Studio Fuga, before Studio Ghibli was built, that's who did all of Miyazaki's backgrounds. Oh. So, again, that's how I was over there. They took me to the studio. And I'm looking, because I'm a big Miyazaki fan. And I'm looking all around the walls here. I'm seeing all these paintings from, Laputa and Warriors of the Wind, and I'm looking at all these different beautiful backgrounds, and I'm going, I could have these in my show. This is so cool. And you know, Disney really, they really let us do so many things that were out of the ordinary for these types of shows. I don't think we realized how special we had it until we no longer were doing that.
Yeah, until it's the way it is now. I remember being at the coffee machine, and there was a guy, I'm not going to name him, but his dad was one of the 9 old men. And he came up to me and he said, "Why are we doing this show?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "This isn't a Disney show." And I said, "Of all people, you should know that if Walt Disney was alive, we'd be doing this show. I mean, he'd be doing all kinds of stuff. He was not a guy that was riveted in the past, otherwise all we'd have were pig movies." And I just couldn't understand that thinking. But there were a lot of people at Disney Studios.
That's a good segue. There's one more thing I want to show. So let me just set that up.
Okay.
Because we've only got about 15 minutes left. It's a good segue because there were a lot of people who had a lot of doubts about this show, particularly as a Disney vehicle. And so we decided, or rather the bosses decided, that we were going to do this big press event at the Universal Sheraton in North Hollywood. And they gathered together. By this time we were in production. We just had a tiny bit of animation back. I mean, almost nothing to work with. But they decided we're going to put this promo together, and we're going to get some of our actors to come in. And so they had Ed Asner come in, and Jonathan Frakes, who played Xanatos. Ed Asner played Hudson, of course. And Bill Fagerbakke, who at the time was a star of the TV sitcom Coach, and is also the voice of Broadway. So they took the three of the most famous on-camera actors that we had in the cast and brought them to this event with me and Gary Kreisel, who was my boss. And we put together this... No, Keith wasn't at that one. We put together this very brief promo. It's about 2 minutes long. And let's show you that, and then I'll tell you what happened afterwards. And turn this one up as loud as you possibly can, because in the Sheraton, it was a room about this size, all press. Everyone in the audience was press, and they had 2 huge speakers and a big floor-to-ceiling screen, like more like this than that. Yeah. Lights, please.
It is an age of darkness. Superstition and the sword rule. It is an age of fear. It is the age of gargoyles.
What could be strong enough to leave claw marks in solid stone?
That's one thing we have in common. Everything's going according to plan.
to the end of that with the cheering and the whooping and all that sort of stuff. So we play this thing at the Sheraton Universal, and when it ends, the reaction is dead pin drop silence.
And then a big cheer.
No. So we all go up on this stage that they've got set up, and in one of the many incidents on this particular show when I'm sitting here thinking, I am so fired. You know, we open it up to questions, and this woman, reporter, raises her hand and says, so this is a Disney show for kids? And she said, would you let your kids watch this? And here was the issue, in terms of the people who were on that specific panel. Ed Asner is a little bit older than the rest of us, and his kids are my age. Gary Kreisel, my boss, was on stage. His kids at the time were teenagers, so sort of out of the age bracket that this woman was asking about. Jonathan Frakes, his wife Jeannie Francis, and my wife were both pregnant with their first kids, but I didn't have any kids to. So it all sort of fell to Bill Fagerbacke, who was the only one in that group who had kids of the age that were an issue. So we just sort of, you know, the mic just sort of got passed down, you know, figuratively to Bill. And Bill just completely off the cuff goes, well, better than Barney. That reaction that you just gave with the laughter and the applause, we got. Because one thing that was true is that there were a lot of parents among all those reporters who had to sit through a lot of episodes of Barney and were not happy about it. And it broke the ice. And from that moment on, one thing I will say is we had a fantastic relationship with the press. Reviewers, press, they got behind our show. We got great write-ups, amazing write-ups in TV Guide, and TV Guide in those days was a bigger deal, sort of when the internet was still sort of proto and not sure what to do with it. I mean, you know, magazines like that were a bigger deal, newspapers were a bigger deal, and we got phenomenal press, and it went a long way towards giving us a first season where we were really a big hit for the studio. And we'd done 13 episodes. We're definitely not going to have time to tell everything about the origin of the show, but we did 13 episodes on a 10-month sliding schedule for season 1. And we were so successful that they came back to us and said, hey, for season 2, you're going to do 52 episodes. And the rest is sort of history. So we've got, what, like about 8 minutes left, so we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. But again, if you don't have time to get your question in now, keep in mind we've got a whole other panel just for questions later tonight. Yeah, right there.
Now, with Gargoyles' popularity, why haven't we seen anything that really could be considered a predecessor to Gargoyles? Something that might, you know, it still has a strong following today. Why hasn't Disney really gotten behind anything like that after the fact?
Ask them for me and let me know the answer. We don't know. I like to think that, you know, nostalgia's on a wave, and if, you know, the shows of the 80s like Transformers and stuff like that can be big movies now, maybe, you know, in 4 or 5 years, there'll be a big Gargoyles movie, hopefully. But, and, you know, once that kind of thing happens, the sky's kind of the limit. But we've never stopped trying to get Disney to do something more with the property, and there just doesn't seem to be any real interest in that right now.
I think one of the issues now is with Disney owning Marvel, their plate is full of like projects. And if, you know, one thing about Hollywood, they will take the easiest and most secure route to making a profit possible. Gargoyles you know, in their mind, they never knew what to do with it. You know, it was always kind of a property that, even in its success, you know, they had a hard time with, and I don't think that, possibly, you know, some executive will come along who watched it like you guys did, and will have faith in it, and then it probably will happen. The technology is up to snuff now. I mean, in the past, after Gargoyles originally came out, there wasn't, and it's probably a good thing it didn't happen, because the technology wouldn't have made it pleasing. But now, man, if you can do Gollum, you can do Goliath, and I think it could be great.
Yeah.
Michael Bay, Goliath.
I just shuddered.
Right there.
In regards to the storyline, I love Gargoyles. It weaves in and out, you know, and you know, things that happened on episode 52 of season 2, you know, comes back to the first episode. I'm just wondering how you got it such a tightly knit storyline, maybe, or like how did you
Index cards. I mean, seriously, lots of index cards. The same method I use for shows like Rebels or Young Justice. I sort of not perfected, I don't think it's perfect even now, but I sort of figured out while working on Gargoyles with some very talented writers, in particular Michael Reeves, who never gets enough credit for Gargoyles, and he was you know, we went through at least 3 writers before we found Michael.
We also took.
Who I also stole from Batman, yeah. And we stole lots of people from Batman.
Once 52 episodes.
Yeah, once Fred came on, it was like, yeah, I know these other guys from Batman we could steal.
You know what it was like? It was like that drawing of the little kid with the balloon, the big shadow.
Yeah,
I
here
get
come
these
all
guys coming over from Warner Brothers, you know, it's like Butch and Brad and all these, Ted, Ted, and they're all monsters.
Yeah. And I'm walking down the hall, oh, who are these guys? And I was standing right between Butch and Ted.
Butch.
What do you want? Yeah. Oh, dude.
I'm not sure it's clear. They were all very tall.
Yeah. Big,
really tall, big guys.
Guys with big foreheads.
With horns that slope backwards.
They look like the bad guy in Highlander.
That's super out anyway, so we had a great team of writers. Gary Sperling, who was amazing. Carrie Bates, Britton Chandler Reeves, Michael Reeves, Lydia Morano, those 5 in particular. There were other writers who did some great work on the show as well, but I would say those 5 were our core.
Yeah, but the big thing is when you have a series like that, you have the kind of control that you have as the head guy to manage all of that.
Yeah.
So you knew where everything was going to go and how to put it there.
Yeah, and back in those days, I had a phenomenal memory. I do not anymore, but in those days I did. I could really keep track in my head of a ton of details, and we did have index cards, but it was nowadays I index card every little tiny detail because I don't trust myself to remember it, but in those days I could remember, we'd only have index cards for the big sweeping things, and we'd plan ahead, particularly season 2, because during season 1 we ran into a little production problem where one episode came back from overseas. It had been the one episode that Walt Disney Japan had subcontracted out. It was Enter Macbeth. And it came back, and everything was so off model that it was basically it was unwatchable. I mean, it just didn't look like our show. So we were forced to send it back for we always called some retakes, but this show, I would say probably 80% of the footage we had to have redone. Wow. The huge problem with that was, this was the one episode we couldn't air out of order because that was the episode where the Gargoyles moved from the castle to the clock tower. So we wound up having to run reruns for 5 weeks. We only needed 2 weeks, but the only reruns we could run was the 5-parter, and you couldn't run 2 weeks of a 5-parter. So we ended up having reruns for 5 weeks, and they were furious at us about this. And they were going, "Can't you air them out of order?" And we were like, if it were any other episode, we'd air it out of order. But this is the one that we can't. So we had to, when we were doing season 2 with 52 episodes, we created what we called the tentpole system, where we would do these multi-parters that we would create as tentpoles. And in between these tentpoles, they could run in any order, but we were particularly attentive to the tentpoles to make sure that the production overseas on them was in good shape so that we wouldn't run into that same kind of problem. And so those sort of sweeping things, that's where we developed the index card system for. Previous to that, I was just like doing 1 index card per episode. Now we were sort of juggling that. And then again, back then I had a really good memory and I could keep all sorts of stuff in my head. I'm a burned out shell now. So now I have to, I put, the novel I wrote, Reign of the Ghost, which is on sale at every signing I'm doing, I'm slipping that in there. I had 693 index cards for Reign of the Ghost, but
Per page.
But back then, and that was it. We'd have these big story meetings once a month where we'd do 4 or break. In those days, probably more like 8 or 9 episodes. Frank would be there, I would be there. The 5 writers I named, 4 of them were story editors on the show, we came up with all the springboards. Frank and I came up with all the springboards for the show, and so we'd pull up a springboard and say, "Who wants this one?" And there was always one of those writers who would go, "Yeah, that one interests me," and they'd grab that and we'd talk out the story and. They write up an outline and then the script, and all of that went through me. And because it all went through me, what that allowed for mostly, not that I was a better writer than them, but it allowed for consistency. In other words, instead of having 4 different or 5 different, or you got all the freelancers, 10 or 12 different writers all writing Goliath slightly differently. Some of them using contractions, some not. I was able to sort of take it and make Goliath always sounded like Goliath, and Elisa always sounded like Elisa, and etc. And I was able to keep track of details in a way that if you're Gary Sperling and only working on 8 out of 52 episodes, even if you're trying, you're not going to know every little thing that's happening in the episodes the other story editors are doing. I was able to be that sort of oversight to make sure that the show was consistent. And then we all loved bringing in those little continuity things that made it special. And that's fundamentally what we did. I'm out of time, but fundamentally what we did is we created a show that we wanted to see. And we just crossed our fingers that there'd be enough people out there like you guys who would agree with us so that the show would be successful. Way out of time. Thank you so much for coming. We'll see you later.